Yesterday when you were talking about the dream, the character on the dream, question came up is whether the character on the dream can affect the dream or can change or in any way has any freedom within the dream. Or can only witness the activity.
I received a complaint after last night's meeting from the translators, who asked me, why don't you talk about Mary and Jane anymore? It's so much easier to translate Mary and Jane than to talk about the dreamer asleep in her bed, dreams that she is the dreamed character, etc., etc. So, out of respect for our dear and long-suffering translators, I'm now going to refer to the dreamer, the one that falls asleep and has the dream, as Mary. Mary falls asleep in Titignano. She dreams that she is Jane walking the streets of Paris. So Jane is the separate subject of experience within the dream, from whose point of view the dreamed world is known. And normally when we have a dream, if we're called Mary, when we fall asleep, we also are called Mary in the dream. But just for ease of communication, so that we don't have two Marys, I call the dreamer Mary and the dreamed character Jane. I'm trying to earn some credibility, some points with our translators. So let's refer. Have you all understood that Mary and Jane? Some people can't stand Mary and Jane. I've never understood why, but. So your question is, does Jane have any freedom?
Yeah, can Jane change anything? Is actually Jane doing something?
Jane feels, as she walks around the streets of Paris, deciding where to have lunch, who to call, where to go, Jane feels that she has freedom. And her feeling that she has freedom is not completely ignorant. Remember, all there is to Jane is Mary's mind. There is no real person called Jane. Jane is just a localization of Mary's mind. So the mind of Jane is just a limitation of the mind of Mary. The only mind there is Mary's mind. So the freedom that Jane feels she has is a limitation of the freedom that is the nature of Mary's mind. But because Jane is a limited version of Mary's mind, the freedom she feels is limited. So Jane feels, I am free wandering around the streets of Paris, but she feels her freedom is limited. And she's right, she is free. She borrows her freedom from the absolute freedom of Mary's mind. But that freedom is mixed with the limitations of her own mind, and therefore she experiences a limited freedom. Now, what is the best use of the freedom that is available to Jane's mind? It is to explore the nature of her own mind and come to the realization, I am Mary. That's when she regains her absolute freedom.
So Jane does self-inquiry and comes to...
That's the best use of Jane's mind, yes. Because in fact, all Jane is, because Jane is a limitation or contraction of Mary's mind, that the full peace and happiness that is the nature of Mary's mind is not felt by Jane. So Jane is suffering. And in fact, everything Jane does in Paris, all the activities, the relationships, everything she does for one reason alone, to find happiness. Happiness is all Jane wants.
But that search for happiness is in Mary's dream?
No, it's Jane that seeks happiness. Mary, remember, has, in order to manifest the streets of Paris, which lie in potential in Mary's mind, Mary has to overlook or forget herself. She has to localize or contract into Jane's mind, and through the agency of Jane's mind, Mary sees the inside of her own mind as the streets of Paris. The price she pays for the manifesting the streets of Paris is the giving up of her happiness, the forgetting of her happiness. And that is why all Janes, that's all of us, all separate selves, have this wound in their heart, this feeling something is missing. I long for something. That longing is the longing for the peace that lies in the essence of our minds, in our true nature. But our culture has lost touch with this understanding, so our culture encourages us to find peace find happiness through the acquisition of objects, substances, states of mind, activities, relationships. So Jane spends most of her life, most of her early life, seeking happiness in objects, substances, relationship, etc. But after a while, she becomes disillusioned with the possibility of the world to give her the happiness for which she longs. And strangely, and of course not so strangely, as this feeling of disillusionment appears in her, she finds herself sitting next to somebody in a cafe on the streets of Paris who's reading a book by Ramana Maharshi. And she asks the person, who is the person on the cover of that book? So the disillusionment she feels on the inside is mirrored in a magical way by her experience in the world, which conforms to her experience. This disillusionment is this longing in her. It's like she's given up, she's surrendered, she doesn't realize it, but she's said to God, I've tried everything in the world, and I realize now it's not going to work. Send me, what can I do? Are there any other possibilities? That's when she meets her friend in the cafe.
Isn't all her search dreamed?
I had a friend, sorry, I'm going to come back to you. That little story is actually a version of a true story that happened to a friend of mine in California who had come to this same sense of despair and frustration. She had tried everything, not only everything in the conventional realm, but also everything in the spiritual realm. She had come to like the prodigal son, to the end of the road. She was in despair, and her despair was like a prayer to God. What next? She went to the public library, and she was casually browsing books, and someone on the aisle, there were bookshelves, two-sided bookshelves in rows. Someone on the other side of the aisle put a book back into the shelf and pushed out on her side a book called Be As You Are by Ramana Maharshi. That was how she was introduced to the non-dual teaching. So, sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh, it's okay. So all this search of Jane's search, and all of this is part of the dream. The dream says that she's searching.
It's part of the dream, but don't forget, Jane doesn't know she's a dreamed character. Jane feels that she is a very real, separate, independently existing self. She doesn't realize that she's a dreamed character in the mind of God, in the mind of Mary. So yes, you can say, from this vantage point, it's all just a dream. But Jane doesn't know it's a dream. Most people in the world, the vast majority of people in the world do not realize that they are simply temporary and imaginary limitations of God's infinite being, and that all we ever see is the inside of God's mind.
So whether Jane realized her true nature or not is not up to her. It depends on, the generator of the dream, God's mind.
Let's go back to the analogy we used a few days ago, where I gave the analogy of a rubber ball. Yes? A rubber ball which in its natural state is in a state of equilibrium, peace, equivalent to peace. Now, when you compress the rubber ball, you set up a tension in the rubber ball, which is always trying to revert to its natural state of equilibrium. Yes? Mary is the rubber ball in its natural state of equilibrium, peace, no tension, nothing missing, not wanting to go anywhere. Jane is a contracted or limited version of Mary. And Jane always feels this tension, this desire to go back to happiness. So from the point of view of the compressed rubber ball, there is a movement towards the expanded rubber ball. So in other words, from the point of view of Jane, there is always this feeling of searching for happiness. Now, it's not really the contracted ball doesn't do anything. If anyone does anything, it is the natural state of the rubber ball which is pulling the contracted ball back to its natural condition. But the rubber ball, the contracted ball, doesn't know that. So Jane, the contracted ball, feels, I am seeking happiness. I am undertaking an effort, a discipline, a practice to acquire happiness. What Jane doesn't realize is that really Mary is pulling Jane back to herself. Mary has compressed herself into Jane, and Mary is now expanding herself back to herself. So actually, Jane does nothing. It is Mary who freely assumes the form of Jane, thereby bringing into actuality the world that lives within her in potential. And then it is Mary that relaxes that contraction and returns to her natural state. So the implication in your question is quite right. Jane doesn't really do anything, but we have to be careful telling that to Jane. We should not say to Jane, there's nobody here and there's nothing to do, because if she buys that line, she will simply stay miserable Jane. It's much truer to say to Jane, yes, there is something you can do. Look for happiness, but look for it in the right place. Look for it in the essence of your own mind. So Jane then embarks on this self-inquiry, which is the highest form of the search for happiness. So what is the search for happiness for Jane? Jane feels she's going towards Mary. Mary is in fact attracting Jane towards herself. So for Jane, what is desire for happiness from the point of view of Jane is in fact grace from the point of view of Mary. It is Mary's grace that is attracting Jane, and Mary's grace does everything. But Jane doesn't realize that, so Jane feels, I am seeking happiness. So the search for happiness and grace are the same thing. It's called grace from Mary's point of view. It's called the search for happiness from Jane's point of view.